All right, we're back to reading more of The Borrowers. There's only 4 more chapters left in this, and we've got more school left. So if you'd like me to start another book, I will. Just give me maybe a thumbs up or maybe a comment to start another book, however you want to do it. I'll know that I should start a new one if enough of you want me to do that. And then I'll just keep going, even if school ends, if we're not done with that book, making videos until we finish that book. All right? Sounds good. I kind of have one in mind that I'd like to do, so just let me know. Okay. Chapter 17. The boy, by the way, has been giving them all kinds of things. The borrowers, it's been pretty nice for them. Now they have all this stuff. Pod kind of doesn't like it because Amelie's been making him move things around all the time. Okay? But here's the problem. They took things, or actually the boy took things from the morning room. And now Mrs. Driver has realized things are missing. So we'll have to see what happens with that. Otherwise, things are going great. Ariette's reading to the boy every day, and she's learning more, and he gets to hear things read, probably learning a little bit about reading, too. All right. Mrs. Driver was short with Crampfurl that evening. That means that she was, not in a good mood when you're short with someone. She would not sit down and drink with him as usual, but stumped about the kitchen, looking at him sideways every now and again out of the corner of her eyes. He seemed uneasy, as indeed he was. There was a kind of menace in her silence, a hidden something which no one could ignore. Even Aunt Sophie had felt it when Mrs. Driver brought up her wine. She heard it in the clink of the decanter against the glass as Mrs. Driver set down the tray, and in the rattle of the wooden rings as Mrs. Driver drew the curtains. It was in the tremble of the floorboards as Mrs. Driver crossed the room, and in the click of the latch as Mrs. Driver closed the door. "What's the matter with her now?" Aunt Sophie wondered vaguely, as delicately, ungreedily she poured the first glass. The boy had felt it too. From the way Mrs. Driver had stared at him as he sat hunched in the bath, from the way she soaped the sponge, and the way that she said, "And now?" She had scrubbed him slowly with a careful, angry steadiness, and all through the bathing time she did not say a word. When he was in bed, she had gone through all his things, peering into cupboards and opening his drawers. She had pulled his suitcase out from under the wardrobe and found his dear dead mole, and his hoard of sugar lumps, and her best potato knife. But even then she had not spoken. She had thrown the mole into the wastepaper basket and had made angry noises with her tongue. She pocketed the potato knife and all the sugar lumps. She had stared at him a moment before she turned the gas low. A strange stare it had been, more puzzled than accusing. So she found things that the boy had taken, but they weren't the things she was looking for. She apparently never really even noticed the potato knife being gone, and the lumps of sugar, nobody noticed those, and the dead mole, well, she didn't even know he had that. Kind of gross. Don't keep dead moles in the house, kids. All right. Mrs. Driver slept above the scullery. A scullery is kind of like a place where you would keep kind of your cooking things and supplies and food things, okay? She had her own back stairs. That night, she did not undress. She set the alarm clock for midnight and put it where the tick would not disturb her outside her door. She unbuttoned her tight shoes and crawled grunting a little under the eiderdown. She had barely closed her eyes, as she told Crampfurl afterward, when the clock shrilled off, chattering and rattling on its 4 thin legs on the bare boards of the passageway. Mrs. Driver tumbled herself out of bed and fumbled her way to the door. "Shh," she said to the clock as she felt for the catch. "Shh," and clasped it to her bosom. She stood there in her stockinged feet at the head of the scullery stairs. Something, it seemed, had flickered below. A hint of light. Mrs. Driver peered down the dark curve of the narrow stairway. Yes, there it was again. A moth-wing flutter. Candlelight, that's what it was. A moving candle beyond the stairs, beyond the scullery, somewhere within the kitchen. We know what it is. Clock in hand, Mrs. Driver creaked down the stairs in her stockinged feet, panting a little in her eagerness. There seemed a sigh in the darkness, an echo of movement, and it seemed to Mrs. Driver, standing there in the cold stone flags of the scullery, that this sound, that was barely a sound, could only mean one thing. The soft swing to the green baize door, that door which led out of the kitchen into the main hall beyond. So she heard that door. It's one of those doors that can kind of go and swish back and forth a little bit. And it seemed to Mrs. Driver standing there in the... I read that part. Here we go. Hurriedly, Mrs. Driver felt her way into the kitchen and fumbled for matches along the ledge above the stove. She knocked off a pepper pot and a paper bag of cloves, and glancing quickly downward, saw a filament of light. She saw it in the second before she struck a match. A thread of light, it looked like, on the floor beside her feet. It ran in an oblong shape, outlining a rough square. Mrs. Driver gasped and lit the gas, and the room leapt up around her. She glanced quickly at the baize door. There seemed to her startled eye a quiver of movement in it, as though it had just swung to. She ran to it and pushed it open, but the passage beyond was still and dark. No flicker of shadow, nor sound of distant footfall. She let the door fall to again, and watched it as it swung back, slowly, regretfully, held by its heavy spring. Yes, that was the sound that she had heard from the scullery, that sighing whisper, like an indrawn breath. Cautiously, clutching back her skirts, Mrs. Driver moved toward the stove. An object lay there, something pinkish on the floor beside the jutting board. Ah, she realized, that board. That was where the light had come from. She hesitated and glanced about the kitchen. Everything else looked normal, and just as she had left it. The plates on the dresser, the saucepans on the wall, and the row of tea towels hanging symmetrically on their string above the stove. The pinkish object she saw now was a heart-shaped cashew box, one that she knew well from the glassed-in tray table beside the fireplace in the drawing room. She picked it up. It was enamel and gold and set with tiny brilliants. "Well, she began, and stooped swiftly with a sudden angry movement. She wrenched back the piece of floor, and then she shrieked, loud and long. She saw movement, a running, a scrambling, a fluttering. She heard a squeaking, a jabbering, and a gasping. Little people, they looked like, with hands and feet and mouths opening. That's what they looked like, but they couldn't be that, of course. Running here, there, and everywhere. "Oh, oh, oh!" she shrieked, and felt behind her for a chair. She clambered onto it, and it wobbled beneath her, and she climbed, still shrieking, from the chair to the table. And there she stood, marooned, crying and gasping and calling out for help, until, after hours it seemed, there was a rattling at the scullery door. Crampfurl it was, roused at last by the light and the noise. "What is it?" he called. "Let me in!" But Mrs. Driver would not leave the table. "A nest! A nest!" she shouted. "Alive and squeaking!" Crampfurl threw his weight against the door and burst open the lock. He staggered, slightly dazed, into the kitchen, his corduroy trousers pulled on over his nightshirt. "Where?" he cried, his eyes wide beneath his tousled hair. "What sort of nest?" Mrs. Driver sobbed, still with fright. Mrs. Driver, sobbing still with fright, pointed at the floor. Crampfurl walked over in his slow, deliberate way and stared down. He saw a hole in the floor, lined and cluttered with small objects. Children's toys, they looked like. Bits of rubbish, that was all. "It's nothing," he said after a moment. "It's that boy, that's what it is." He stirred the contents with his foot, and all the partitions fell down. "There ain't nothing alive in there." "Oh, but I saw them, I tell you," gasped Mrs. Driver. "Little people, like with hands, or mice dressed up." Crampfurl stared into the hole. "Mice dressed up?" he repeated uncertainly. "Oh, hundreds of them," went on Mrs. Driver. "Running and squeaking. Oh, I saw 'em, I tell you." "Well, there ain't nothing there now," said Crampfurl, and he gave a final stir around with his boot. "Well, then they've run away," she cried, under the floor, up inside the walls. "The place is alive with them." "Well," said Crampfurl stolidly, "maybe. But if you ask me, I think it's that boy, where he hides things." His eye brightened, and he went down on one knee. "Where he's got the ferret, I shouldn't wonder." "Listen!" cried Mrs. Driver, and there was a despairing note in her voice. "You've got to listen. This wasn't no boy, and it wasn't no ferret." She reached for the back of the chair and lowered herself clumsily onto the floor. She came beside him to the edge of the hole. "They had hands and faces, I tell you. Look," she said, pointing. "See that? It's a bed. And now I come to think of it, one of 'em was in it." "Now you come to think of it," said Crampfurl. "Yes," went on Mrs. Driver firmly. "And there's something else. I come to think I remember that girl, Rosa Pickhatchet. The one that was simple. Well, simple or not, she saw one in the drawing-room mantelpiece, with a beard." "One what?" asked Crampfurl. Mrs. Driver glared at him. "What I've been telling you about. One of these mice dressed up," said Crampfurl. "Not mice," Mrs. Driver almost shouted. "Mice don't have beards." "But you said," began Crampfurl. "Yes, I know I said it. Not that these had beards, but what would you call them? What would you say they be but mice?" "Not so loud," whispered Crampfurl. "You'll wake the house up." "They can't hear," said Mrs. Driver. "Not through the baize door." She went to the stove and picked up the fire tongs. "And what if they do? We ain't done nothing. Moreover," she went on, "and let me get at that hole. Move over, and let me get at that hole." One by one, Mrs. Driver picked things out, with many shocked gasps, cries of amazement, and "Did you evers?" She made 2 piles on the floor, one of valuables, and one of what she called rubbish. Curious objects dangled from the tongs. "Would you believe it? Her best lace handkerchiefs. Look, here's another. Oh, and another! And my big mattress needle. I knew I had one. My silver thimble, if you please. Oh, and one of hers. And look, oh my, at the wools, the cottons. No wonder you can never find a spool of white cotton if you want one. Potatoes, nuts. Look at this, a pot of caviar. Caviar! No, it's too much, it really is. Dolls' chairs, tables. Oh, and look at all this blotting paper. So that's where it goes. Oh, my goodness gracious, she cried suddenly, her eyes staring. What's this? Mrs. Driver laid down the tongs and leaned over the hole, tentatively and fearfully, as though afraid of being stung. It's a watch. An emerald watch. Her watch. And she's never missed it. Her voice rose. And it's going. Look, you can see by the kitchen clock. 12:25. Mrs. Driver sat down suddenly on a hard chair. Her eyes were staring and her face looked white and flabby as though deflated. You know what this means, she said to Crampfurl. No, he said. The police, said Mrs. Driver. That's what this means. A case for the police. That's the end of that chapter. So, all the things were found, and basically, Homily and Arrietty and Pod's house got destroyed because they ran their foot through it and knocked everything over that made their walls, and they pulled everything out, and now they've been discovered. We'll have to see what happens next.